how to use all the spells in the Lore of the Big WAGH. Let's go! First up, Gaze of Mork, a magic missile with about a third of its damage being armor piercing, so best to use against light to medium armored enemies, and as it says, good against large combatants, but we'll test that in a second. Only costs 5 winds of magic, so pretty cheap, and the upgraded version is only 2 extra winds of magic for double damage. So that'll be worth it in a lot of situations. So to test it here against some large combatants, winged lancers, and some things in the woods, we're going to hit both of those with an upgraded Gaze of Mork and see how much damage we do. Bear in mind as well, this is a very low trajectory spell, so you want to be aware of your terrain. And hitting both of our targets here, you can see we did a good bit of damage to the things in the wood, about a quarter of their health gone from that one. And against the winged lancers, about the same, maybe a little less. They are a little more heavily armored though. And if we look at the damage here on the Shamans, this one shot the Lancers, 1400 damage dealt, not too bad at all. And the Shaman that shot the things in the wood, 1500 damage. So about the same performance shooting monstrous infantry or cavalry. Well, shooting at the single entity Lord, who is only on foot, so he is quite a small target, still mostly hit him, did a little bit of damage. And shooting at an incarnate elemental of beasts, didn't do much to that at all, although it does have a 20% spell resistance. And if we look at the damage number on the Shamans now, bearing in mind they already have shot something else before this, 1900 for this one now, that was 1400 before, so that's 500 damage, and this one 2000 damage, it was 1500 before, so again about 500 damage. So what do we learn from this? Gaze of Mork, good for shooting at cavalry, good for shooting at monstrous infantry, not so good at shooting at single entity monsters or lords or heroes on mounts. It's a bit of a waste on those. However, you want to know the real secret power of this spell? Use it on infantry. But Zerk, the unit card says use it against large. Well, let me show you on these Home Masters of Swordeth. You see, if we position ourselves just right, we can make magic missile spells absolutely disgusting. What we're looking for is at least 2 units of infantry that are kind of in a straight line. Here we've got all 3, and we want to put our caster in line with those 3, and then aim the spell not at the closest unit, don't shoot that one, aim for either the second or even third unit in the line, and then, well, this. Watch in awe as 2 units of Home Masters get about half of their health ripped off just from that one upgraded Gaze of Mork. And how much damage did our Shaman do with that one spell? 5,600 damage. Just a little more than against large, huh? Here's another one from the opposite side. Absolutely going to finish these 2 units off, allowing the Orc boys to beat the Home Masters and get a hell of a lot more damage done to an enemy army than you would shooting at large. And how much damage has he done now with 2 spells? 10,000 damage, just from 2 upgraded Gaze of Mork for 14 winds of magic. So if you want to make the most of Gaze of Mork, you can shoot it at large cavalry and monstrous infantry, and you'll get some decent return there, not bad in the right situation. But if you really want to profit from this spell, use it on lined up infantry. Even if they're not perfectly lined up, something like this, I'm shooting at the unit farther away, I managed to hit the one in the middle. That hits 2 units rather than 1, doubling our damage potential. I guess it would work on cavalry and monstrous infantry too if they were bunched up in a line in the same way. Moving on now to Brainburster, an explosion spell, only 7 winds of magic. Take note, the normal version does 0 armor piercing damage, so it sucks on anything above like 30 or 40 armor. That's where the upgraded version comes in. For an extra 3 winds of magic, you can get about a third of the damage as armor piercing, a little more damage overall as well. That's going to make it a bit more useful against those more armored targets. I'd say up to like 70 or 80 armor though. Anything above that's probably not worth using this spell on. For example, using it on bleak swords that have 40 armor, you can see it does a fair bit of damage there, about a quarter of their health maybe. And then against something even more lightly armored, the witch elves, we're going to do about the same amount of damage to them. They don't have any protection from this. Their physical resistance won't help them because it's a magical spell. And as we see, using it on executioners who have 100 armor, it barely really does anything, so not worth using it on units that are heavily armored. And this is actually a really good spell to use on moving units because it's quite easy to line up. So you can see how there's 2 circles to the spell, the outer one and the inner one with the explosion. Well, if you line up the front of the enemy unit with that inner circle, as soon as they step into it, pop it about there and you should get a decent landing of this spell. Bang, right in the middle of them, does the most damage you're going to get out of it. So yeah, that's an easy way to line it up. Just wait till the unit steps inside that inner circle and then drop it. Obviously, some units are faster than others, so witch elves, you might need to drop it a little sooner. A slightly more optimal way though to use it against a single unit is to have a single entity make the unit gather all around them, and then you can hit probably the entire unit that's gathered around your single entity and do maximal damage. The real optimum way to make use of this spell though is to fill that circle up with infantry as much as possible, but finding a blob that's going to fill it up will be a rare situation, so just look out for those blobs of infantry, however big they might be. Another good spot you can use this spell is against missile units that are bombarding you, as it'll not only damage them but also knock them around so they can't shoot for a while. And that's a good option if the enemy infantry units are engaged with yours. You don't really want to use this spell on an infantry that's fighting yours because it is going to damage your unit as well. Unless the enemy unit is particularly expensive and your unit is goblins, maybe it'd be worth the sacrifice. So Brainburster, overall, a great anti-light infantry spell. I'd say use the upgraded version if your target is a little more expensive and worth the cost. Next, we have Headbutt. Now, this spell is basically exactly the same as the previous one. It's very cheap at only 5 winds of magic, no armor-piercing damage on this, pretty much the same damage. The upgraded version, quite a bit more expensive, but does add some damage onto that. But yeah, overall, this one is pretty much just a different shaped Brainburster. As you can see, it's more of a triangle shape, which does make it a little bit harder to use against units on the move. Timing it is a little bit tougher. You can see it's like a big, quick shotgun blast to the face of the enemy units, and again, doing very similar damage to Brainburster. So what the hell is the point of this spell, I hear you cry? Well, unlike Brainburster, it can actually work against units that are in combat with your boys, without too much risk of friendly fire, provided that you position it well. I find about here-ish, just getting the unit to the edges of the spell shape, and then you'll see it does a good bit of damage to the enemy, and minimal damage to our unit. And I'd say, honestly, that's probably the only real practical use of this spell. Everything else is better done by Brainburster, because you can overcast it, which is cheaper, and add some armor-piercing damage. So if there is a particular enemy unit you want to damage that is fighting your front line, this is a great spell to help you do it. And of course, again, if you can fill the shape up with as many enemy infantry bodies as possible, that's going to maximize the amount of damage you can do with this. You just got to look out for those situations. And again, just like Brainburster, it can be good for knocking missile units around to stop them from firing at you and damaging them in the process. And remember, don't use this on heavily armored units because it will barely do anything and you'll get diminishing returns the higher the enemy's armor. So again, another decent anti-light infantry spell, which gives you the option of damaging enemy units that are engaged with yours without too much risk of friendly fire. Moving on now to Fist of Gork, an incredibly important spell for the Greenskins because it imbues magical attacks, something their army massively lacks. Do you know how many units in the Greenskins army have magical attacks? 1, and it's the Regiment of Renown Rogue Idol. So for 7 winds of magic, you can imbue any unit with magical attacks as well as a melee defense and melee attack boost. But for the most part, the magical attacks is the real seller here. Because of things like ethereal units that have a 55% physical resistance, your boys are really going to struggle with them unless they are imbued with magical attacks, which will allow them to bypass that. And as you can see here, this unit that does have Fist of Gork is doing okay against the Ghost, while our unit without Fist of Gork is struggling. And after 1 Fist of Gork, it does allow our boys to beat the Cairn Wraiths with more than half their health left, and the unit with no such buff ended up losing to the Cairn Wraiths, so quite a big difference. But ethereal units with that big physical resistance are few and far between in the game, so using it against things like demons is probably going to be more realistic. They only have a 20% physical resistance, so it's not as big of a boost as against something like the Cairn Wraiths, but still a 20% damage boost against any of these strong demon units is going to be welcome. So using it on something like my Boar Boy Biggins here, taking on some Blood Crushers, a very strong cavalry, the magical attacks plus the melee defense and melee attack boost is going to allow them to perform much better in this fight. Even if they don't win, they'll still do way more damage than they would have done without it. Or over here, we've got some Biggins taking on a Bloodthirster. Again, beefing them up to 62 melee attack is going to help a lot with their damage output and the magical attacks for an extra 20% as well. Using it in some situations like this one, Orc Boys versus Bloodletters, maybe it's a bit of a waste. 7 winds of magic, Orc Boys aren't going to do a great deal of damage because they're only a cheap unit comparatively to what Biggins or Black Orcs or Trolls could do. So obviously you're going to get more out of this spell if you use it on your stronger units. But as demonstrated earlier with the Cairn Wraiths, there is a time and a place to even use it on Orc Boys, and sometimes just use it regardless of the magical attacks. Even if you don't need the magical attacks, it's still a nice damage and defense boost for any unit in a tough fight that you want to perform better. Next, here we go, a classic area buff 40 melee attack for all units it hits, for a not cheap, not expensive 11 winds of magic, lasting a good 38 seconds as well. Now this can just be a good old classic frontline buffer, simply allowing whatever your frontline is to churn out more damage. Now of course that's always going to be helpful, but much the same point as I just made, if you use it on cheaper units like Orc Boys or Goblins, you're only going to get so much return on that spell, especially if the unit should break and run away, because then they're not going to be making any use of it at all. So using it on the stronger parts of your army is going to make this spell a little more optimal. 2 units of Boar Boy Biggins here taking on Skull Crushers, one of the strongest anti-large cavalries in the game. 40 extra melee attack for these 2 units is certainly going to help them get rid of this unit a lot quicker, meaning they'll be healthier to take on more units afterwards. Or later on in the battle when it becomes a bit of a mess, as they always do, you can use it on any of your clumped up stronger units, like Trolls here, Boar Boy, Cav, Lords and Heroes. The more you can hit, the better, because there is no limit with how many units you can hit with this spell, so land it on as much as you can. And with that in mind, it can be one of those strong spells you actually want to work around and plan for, rather than just using it opportunistically. For example, if you've got an Orc Boy or Goblin frontline, stick some Trolls in there and your Lords and Heroes and buff all of that up with Here We Go, and there's a lot of potential extra damage output you can get right there. But overall, it is quite a versatile spell. A lot of extra melee attack is going to be handy anywhere, but if you want to optimize it, hit as much as you can on those stronger units. And lastly, a good old classic, the Foot of Gork. This is a very expensive spell at 18 Winds of Magic. Good damage on it, a third of its armor piercing, so not too bad. It's designed to hit multiple infantry units at a time. There is an upgraded version for a whopping 26 Winds of Magic, increases the damage output and the armor piercing damage a little. You can kind of think of this spell as like a much bigger version of Brainburster, except it is not very good against a single unit. As you'll see here, hits these Bloodletters, doesn't really do a great deal of damage, not much more than Brainburster to be honest. So don't drop it on a single unit. It used to be good at that back in the day, but now it's changed. It only really works well against multiple units that are all clumped up together like so. And again, like with many explosion spells, the more you can fill up the circle, the more damage you're gonna do. So you just gotta keep an opportunistic eye out for those clumpy infantry situations. And much like Brainburster, it's not going to be great used on your front line with your infantry because you are going to smash them up in the process. If it's something cheap and crappy like Goblins, might be worth the sacrifice, otherwise maybe not. Depends on the enemy units, are they worth killing and killing your own unit for. Obviously, this is going to be a great spell for choke point battles or sieges, minor settlements, wherever enemy units may get all clumped up. You can absolutely destroy them, filling up that circle as much as you can. As you can see here, hitting 5 or 6 Empire Swordsman units, absolutely going to obliterate the most of them. So no doubt we're going to get a good return on our 18 Winds of Magic spent. And if we look at the damage done on our Shaman, it's a pretty porky 27,000 damage done. However, Brainburster, while good against a single unit, is also still good against multiple units, and costs about half as much as Foot of Gork. So how much damage did one of those do on a crowd? Well, a still pretty porky 15,000 damage. So that was an upgraded one, that's 10 Winds of Magic. Here's another one, so that's 20 Winds of Magic, a little more than Foot of Gork at 18, but after 2 of those it's 27,000 damage, the same as the Foot of Gork. So with a little bit of rough testing, it's a very similar performance between these 2 spells, although I'd say on the Foot of Gork I had a better crowd to hit than I did with the 2 Brainbursters, so they may have even performed better. I'd say go for Foot of Gork if you can fill up most of the circle. If you've got half of it empty like here, well, you're kind of wasting it, so you might just be better off with an upgraded Brainburster. Or if there's a clump of heavily armored enemy units altogether, like if you're fighting the Dwarfs for example, then the upgraded Foot of Gork might come in handy. Otherwise, honestly, you're going to get the same kind of performance out of upgraded Brainbursters, provided the enemy doesn't have too much armor. So yeah, Foot of Gork, a very strong spell, but you really got to find the situation to make it worthwhile for that big magic cost. So that's all the spells in the Big WAGH lore, but one extra note to add about this is, like I mentioned earlier, the Greenskins really lack magical attacks, and most of their magic damage comes from either the imbuement of Fist of Gork, but also just the magical spells themselves, as they all do magic damage. The Brainburster, the Edbutt, the Gaze of Mork, the Foot of Gork. Remember, these all do magical damage, so they're going to be good against those demons or any elves with physical resistances, any units with physical resistances. These spells are going to be especially good for that extra damage. So try to priority target any unit with physical resistances, demons, undead, whatever, just to get that little bit more out of your magical spells. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I got a playlist of this if you want some more of it. If you'd like to consider supporting the channel, do check out the channel memberships or Patreon. Otherwise, I will see you in the future.